The year was 1837, and the sun hung high over the sugar plantations of Louisiana, where the landscape was marked by rows of crops and the toil of enslaved men and women. The estate, stretching across vast acres, belonged to the Duchamp family, a legacy built on the backs of those who were forced into bondage. Life for the enslaved people on the plantation was harsh, their days long and grueling under the ever-watchful eye of overseers. For them, the only respite came at night, when they could retreat into the meager comfort of their cabins. Marie, an enslaved woman on the Duchamp plantation, was one of the many women forced to work the fields and tend to the needs of the family. She had lived in silence for most of her life, as had the others. Silence that was cultivated and enforced by a system that treated them as property rather than human beings. The enslaved were meant to remain unseen and unheard, their suffering ignored by those who wielded power over them. But in 1837, something happened that would shatter that silence and set in motion a chain of events that no one on the Duchamp plantation could have foreseen. Marie gave birth to a child, Claire, whose appearance defied all logic. Her skin was pale, her hair a golden blonde, and her eyes were a striking shade of blue. The baby was a living anomaly. In a world where race and bloodlines determined everything, Claire's birth raised immediate questions. Marie had been assigned a partner, Thomas, a man who shared her African descent, yet Claire's features were nothing like his or Marie's. This was not the first time something unusual had happened in the plantation system, but it was the first time anyone had dared to question the origins of these children, born with features that suggested European ancestry. What could this mean? The first child's birth was followed by more strange occurrences across other plantations. Children were born with the same golden hair, the same blue eyes, and the same pale skin, features that seemed out of place in a world defined by strict racial boundaries. The whispers began to spread, and with each new birth, the mystery deepened. Vincent Hebert, the overseer of the Duchamp plantation, was not one to entertain rumors. He had spent years ensuring the plantation's operations ran smoothly, keeping order among the enslaved and adhering to the expectations of his masters. But something about the strange births nagged at him. It wasn't just the oddity of it, it was the fact that something, or someone, was deliberately altering the course of nature. Hebert knew that he couldn't ignore what was happening, but he had no way of knowing how deep the conspiracy ran. Hebert kept a journal of his observations, recording the strange pattern of these blue-eyed, blonde-haired children. His suspicion grew when the second child, born to a woman on another plantation, shared the same characteristics as Claire. He began to realize that these were not mere anomalies. They were part of a larger pattern. And the more he looked into the births, the more he began to suspect foul play. As he began to probe further, he found that each of these children had been born in the wake of Dr. Marcus Levine's visits. Dr. Levine was a trusted local physician, known for his skill and discretion. But Hebert soon learned that Levine had been more than just a doctor to the enslaved women. He had been treating them for various ailments, often offering remedies and medicines that seemed to have no clear purpose. Hebert grew increasingly suspicious of Levine's presence at the plantations, especially when the births of these strange children began to occur shortly after the doctor's visits. Levine had been administering something to the women, but what exactly had he been giving them? And why were the children born with European features? The questions plagued Hebert, but he knew he had to dig deeper. One evening, Hebert visited Marie, the mother of the first blue-eyed child, Claire. He approached her cautiously, not sure how to broach the subject. But when he asked about the child's unusual appearance, Marie remained calm, though there was a sadness in her voice. She explained that she had been visited by Dr. Levine shortly before her pregnancy, though she insisted that Thomas, her assigned partner, was the father. When Hebert probed further, Marie could offer no explanation for her child's unusual features. She had no answers, only the quiet resignation that often came with being an enslaved woman, resignation to a fate that she had no control over. As Hebert's investigation continued, he uncovered more disturbing details. The children born with the strange features seemed to be the result of Levine's treatments, but why had the doctor been performing these actions? Was it medical malpractice, or was there a more sinister purpose at play? And could Levine be acting alone, or was there someone else behind these experiments? Hebert was at a crossroads. He knew that exposing Levine would be dangerous, especially since the doctor was a well-respected figure in the community. But Hebert also knew that the truth could not remain hidden for much longer. The more he delved into the mystery, the more he realized that what had begun as an isolated incident was part of a much larger conspiracy, one that involved not just Levine, but possibly the very system of slavery that kept them all in place. Marie's calmness in the face of her child's strange appearance had disturbed Hebert. She wasn't surprised, and she wasn't questioning. Instead, she had accepted her fate, as so many enslaved people had done before her. But Hebert couldn't accept it. Something had to be done. The truth needed to be revealed. And though he wasn't sure where it would lead, he knew that it was a journey he had to take. As Hebert's suspicions grew, he began to gather evidence. He spoke to other mothers, all of whom insisted that their children had been fathered by their assigned partners. But none of the women could explain the unusual features of their children. They all seemed to be hiding something. Whether it was fear or guilt, Hebert couldn't say. But he knew that the more he looked into it, the more the truth seemed to slip further out of his grasp. Hebert's investigation into Dr. Marcus Levine's involvement in the mysterious births had turned into an obsession. As he spent more time questioning the women and observing the strange pattern of children born with blonde hair and blue eyes, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. But with each revelation, Hebert also found himself facing deeper moral dilemmas. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that exposing Levine's actions could unravel the very fabric of the plantation system, one that had been carefully constructed over centuries. This wasn't just about a single doctor committing a crime. It was about an entire system built on exploitation and control. Despite his growing concerns, Hebert knew he couldn't back away. The children's existence could not be explained by coincidence, and Levine's repeated visits to the plantations were too suspicious to ignore. Hebert's suspicion reached its peak when he learned that Levine had been involved with a growing number of enslaved women. Each visit was followed by the birth of another child with the same unusual features. As Hebert's investigation continued, he began to gather evidence that pointed to a disturbing pattern. Levine had been acting under the guise of a trusted physician, but Hebert now suspected that the doctor was using his medical position to conduct experiments. Experiments on the enslaved women, exploiting them for a purpose that was unclear, but far from innocent. Hebert started to wonder if Levine had been attempting to alter the genetics of the enslaved population. Could this be part of some larger plan? Was the doctor working with someone, or was he operating independently? Hebert found himself drawn into a labyrinth of questions, each answer raising more uncertainties. His initial suspicion of Levine grew into a deep unease. What could the doctor be trying to achieve by altering the reproductive capabilities of the enslaved women? Why were these children born with such distinct features? And why had no one spoken up about Levine's increasing involvement with the enslaved women? Hebert began to think of Isabel, a young woman who had been reluctant to speak out, but had eventually confided in him about her experience with Levine. Isabel had given birth to a child who also had the same blue eyes and blonde hair, and she too had insisted that her partner Gabriel was the father. But when Hebert questioned her further, she told him of a strange visit from Levine. Isabel had fallen ill with a fever, and Levine had arrived at her cabin under the pretense of offering her treatment. But Isabel's account of the visit made Hebert uneasy. She recalled how Levine had stayed much longer than usual, and how he had given her an unfamiliar concoction, a strange drink he claimed would help her recover. "I didn't know what he gave me," Isabel told Hebert, her voice trembling as she spoke of the doctor. "He said it would help with the fever, but after I drank it, I felt different. I don't remember much after that, but when I woke up, I was pregnant. And this child is Gabriel's, but it's not Gabriel's. It's something else." The implication of her words hung heavy in the air. Isabel's story was another piece of the puzzle that Hebert could not ignore. Levine had given her a strange concoction, one that had led to a pregnancy, one that had produced a child with features that were out of place on an enslaved person's child. Hebert's stomach churned as he thought about the implications of what he had just learned. Levine's actions went beyond simple medical treatment. They were part of something much darker. As Hebert continued his investigation, he found that Isabel's story wasn't an isolated case. Other women had similar experiences with Levine, and all of them spoke of his visits, of his strange treatments, and of the results, children who didn't belong in the world they were born into. Hebert's mind raced as he connected the dots. There could be no more denying it. Levine was conducting some kind of experiment, but what was its purpose? And why were the enslaved women his subjects? Hebert's suspicions deepened as he began to suspect that Levine's experiments weren't merely medical malpractice. They were deliberate and calculated. He began to theorize that Levine might have been attempting to improve the enslaved population, trying to create a generation of children who would be more acceptable to the ideals of the European masters, children who could be seen as better than the rest. Hebert's mind was flooded with questions. Had Levine been working alone, or was there a higher power behind his experiments? What were the master's roles in all of this? And what would happen if this information came to light? Despite the evidence he had gathered, Hebert knew that exposing Levine would be dangerous. The doctor was well respected in the community, and Hebert had no doubt that the plantation owners would protect him, perhaps even at all costs. The threat of retaliation loomed over Hebert's every move. If the truth came out, it could not only ruin Levine's career, it could bring the entire plantation system to its knees. The question Hebert now faced was whether he was willing to risk everything for the truth. But even as Hebert wrestled with his decision, he realized there was no turning back. The evidence was clear, and the lives of the enslaved women and children had been manipulated and exploited in ways that could not be ignored. The system that had allowed Levine's actions to continue for so long was the same system that had subjugated and oppressed the enslaved for generations. It was time for the truth to be told, no matter the cost. Hebert made a decision. He would take what he had learned to the authorities. He would expose Levine and the dark conspiracy behind the strange births. But he also knew that doing so would come at great personal risk. If the authorities didn't act, or worse, if they sided with the plantation owners, Hebert could lose everything: the respect of his peers, his position as overseer, and possibly even his life. Still, Hebert felt that this was a fight worth having. He couldn't stay silent anymore. The enslaved women, who had been silenced for so long, had finally found their voices, and Hebert was determined to make sure those voices were heard. Hebert's decision to expose Dr. Marcus Levine's role in the strange births set him on a path fraught with danger and uncertainty. He knew that going to the authorities would be a risky move, and he wasn't sure whether anyone would believe him, let alone act on the evidence he had gathered. He could feel the weight of the truth bearing down on him, but there was no turning back now. The lives of the enslaved women, the children born with European features, and the twisted actions of Levine could no longer be ignored. Hebert decided to approach Sheriff Moore, a man who, despite his position, had shown occasional sympathy toward the enslaved. Moore had been a quiet ally to Hebert over the years, someone Hebert could trust. But Hebert knew that even Moore would be taking a significant risk by becoming involved in exposing Levine's actions. The sheriff had been a part of the very system Hebert was trying to bring down. He had worked under the same oppressive structure that had allowed Levine to operate unchecked for so long. When Ebert met with Moore, the sheriff was unusually somber. It wasn't just the seriousness of the situation, it was something deeper. Moore, like Ebert, was beginning to realize that the foundation of the entire plantation system was at stake. There was more at play here than just a single doctor's malpractice. The very system that had kept the enslaved people oppressed, that had kept them silent and powerless, was now being challenged. Moore understood this, but he also knew how powerful the plantation owners were, and the consequences of going against them could be disastrous. "We need to act fast," Ebert said, his voice steady despite the tension. "I've gathered the evidence, Sheriff. We have testimonies from the women, records from Levine's visits, and there's no denying it. Levine has been experimenting with these women, altering their bodies. We have to expose him. We can't let this go on." Moore nodded slowly, his eyes heavy with concern. "You're right. This can't continue. But you also need to understand that going after Levine is going to make powerful enemies. The plantation owners won't take this lying down. They'll protect him, and they'll protect the system that lets them keep their control over the enslaved. If you move forward, you risk everything." "I know," Ebert replied, his voice tight with determination. "But if we don't act now, we'll lose the chance to expose the truth. These women deserve justice. These children deserve justice. We have to bring Levine's crimes into the open." Moore sighed, looking away for a moment. "I've seen enough to know that you're right. But if you go to the authorities, we have to be prepared for the consequences. They'll try to discredit everything, say that the women's testimonies don't count. They'll claim that Levine's actions weren't intentional or that he was just doing his job. You're going to need more than just words. You'll need hard evidence, and you'll need to act fast." Hebert felt the gravity of Moore's warning. The sheriff was right. The system that had allowed Levine's actions to continue was deeply entrenched, and Hebert was about to challenge it. The authorities were not on his side. They were aligned with the wealthy plantation owners who had a vested interest in keeping things as they were. The truth as it stood threatened to unravel everything. With Moore's reluctant agreement, Hebert moved forward. They gathered what evidence they could, further testimonies from the enslaved women, Levine's records, and any medical evidence that could be used to prove the doctor's misconduct. Hebert knew the case would be difficult to win, especially given the powerful people involved. But he also knew that the truth was their most powerful weapon. If they could expose Levine's role in manipulating the women's bodies, it would be impossible to ignore. On the day Hebert planned to present the evidence to the local authorities, he met with Marie one last time before the meeting. She had been the driving force behind the movement, and now Hebert could see the weight of the moment in her eyes. She knew the risks, knew that this could end with Levine walking free, and yet she remained steadfast. "You've done everything you can," Marie said, her voice calm but filled with emotion. "You've given these women a voice. You've given them a chance at justice. And no matter what happens today, that's something they'll never be able to take away." Hebert nodded, his heart heavy with the knowledge that, regardless of the outcome, the fight for justice had already begun. "I just hope it's enough. I hope the truth will be enough to make them see." Marie smiled faintly, a mix of sadness and resolve in her expression. "The truth is powerful, Vincent. It's more powerful than they think. No matter how hard they try to suppress it, it will come to light." With those words, Hebert felt a renewed sense of determination. No matter what happened next, they had already made a difference. They had already shown the world that the truth could not be buried, and that the lives of the enslaved women mattered. As Hebert walked into the sheriff's office later that day, he was filled with a sense of urgency. The moment had arrived. He was about to take everything they had learned to the authorities. There would be no going back. This could either be the beginning of the end for Levine and the system he represented, or it could be the moment when the truth was silenced forever. Sheriff Moore had already made the arrangements for the meeting, and as Hebert entered the room, he was greeted by several of the town's prominent figures. The sheriff's presence gave Hebert some measure of confidence, but he knew that the people sitting across from him were not interested in the truth, at least not in the way he saw it. The wealthy landowners, the people who controlled the town and its economy, were already invested in maintaining the status quo. The truth was a threat to their power, and Hebert knew that the fight for justice was just beginning. Hebert stood before the authorities, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was dimly lit, and the air was thick with the weight of the moment. Sheriff Moore stood by his side, a quiet ally in a room full of people who had more to lose than they were willing to admit. As Hebert began to speak, he could feel the eyes of the plantation owners and their representatives on him, their gazes cold and calculating. They were powerful men, men who had built their fortunes on the backs of enslaved labor, and they would do anything to protect their interests. Hebert started by laying out the evidence, the testimonies of the enslaved women, the records of Dr. Marcus Levine's visits, and the disturbing pattern of strange births that followed his presence. He spoke of the children born with blonde hair and blue eyes, features that seemed out of place in a world where race was the defining factor of one's life. Hebert's voice was steady, though his mind raced with the weight of what he was doing. He was challenging a system that had been in place for centuries, a system that had oppressed countless people and allowed men like Levine to operate with impunity. "This is not just about Dr. Levine," Hebert said, his voice rising with emotion. "This is about the entire system, the system that has allowed this to happen. These women have been used, manipulated, and exploited, and these children, born into this world without their consent, deserve justice." The room was silent for a moment, and Hebert could feel the tension building. The authorities were listening, but it was clear they were not eager to hear the truth. They were uncomfortable, uneasy, and perhaps even frightened by what Hebert was saying. He knew that they had no interest in dismantling the system that had given them power. For them, the truth was a threat, and they would do everything in their power to dismiss it. One of the plantation owners, a man named Mr. Lambert, leaned forward in his chair, his eyes narrowed. "You're accusing a respected physician of crimes, Mr. Hebert, but where is the proof? These are just rumors and stories. Are you suggesting that Dr. Levine intentionally manipulated these women to create children? Is that your theory?" Hebert's stomach tightened. He had expected resistance, but the blatant dismissal of the truth stung nonetheless. "I'm not suggesting anything," Hebert replied, his voice steady. "I'm presenting the facts. These women have all given birth to children with features that are completely out of place. The evidence is clear. Dr. Levine's involvement in their pregnancies is undeniable." The room fell silent again, the weight of Hebert's words hanging in the air. The plantation owners exchanged glances, their discomfort palpable. It was clear that they didn't want to acknowledge the evidence, didn't want to confront the reality of what was happening under their noses. They had built their lives on the backs of the enslaved, and the idea that their entire system might be exposed for the cruelty it truly was something they couldn't bear. Sheriff Moore, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. "I've seen the records myself, gentlemen," he said, his voice calm but firm. "There's no denying that something has been happening on these plantations. Whether or not Levine intended to cause harm is irrelevant at this point. What matters is that these women and their children have been affected by something that cannot be explained away as coincidence." Hebert glanced at Moore, grateful for the sheriff's support, but he knew that their words would only go so far. The truth was difficult to swallow, and the authorities were not ready to confront it. He could see it in their eyes, the fear of what would happen if they acknowledged the full scope of what had been done. The tension in the room was thick as the plantation owners began to murmur among themselves. Mr. Lambert, who had remained silent for the longest time, stood up abruptly. "This is preposterous," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. You're accusing a man who has served this community for years of criminal activity without a shred of proof. And for what? To tear down a system that has worked for generations? To undermine the very foundation of the economy of this town? This is madness. Hebert's pulse quickened as Lambert's words landed like a slap. The plantation owners saw this not as a moral issue, but as a threat to their power. Hebert had known this would happen, but hearing it stated so plainly still stung. For them, the enslaved were commodities, not human beings. The system had worked for them because they had controlled everything, every aspect of the lives of the people they exploited. "We're not here to tear down anything," Hebert said, his voice unwavering despite the pressure mounting around him. "We're here to expose the truth. You can dismiss it all you want, but these women deserve justice. These children deserve justice. And this system, the one that lets you and others like you exploit people for profit, has to change." There was a long pause before another voice spoke, this time from one of the local landowners, a man named Mr. Carver. "Mr. Hebert," he began, his tone measured but heavy with skepticism, "you speak of justice, but you must understand that the system you wish to dismantle has provided stability for years. These children, these anomalies, are no more than curiosities. And Dr. Levine has provided services to the community. Are you suggesting that we destroy that for the sake of a few children?" Hebert could feel the anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. This was not the time for emotion. This was the time for truth. "This is not about a few children," Hebert said, his voice cutting through the room. "This is about the lives of hundreds of people who have been manipulated, used, and discarded. You speak of stability, but stability built on exploitation is not worth preserving. The truth is not something that can be ignored any longer. If you cannot see that, then you are no better than the system you protect." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, the weight of Hebert's words settling heavily over everyone present. He knew that this meeting, no matter how it went, would have consequences. But he couldn't walk away. He couldn't allow Levine's actions, or the plantation owner's complicity, to remain unchecked. "Sheriff Moore," Hebert said, turning to the man who had been silently observing, "you know what needs to be done. You have the power to make this right. Don't let them silence us." Sheriff Moore's gaze met Hebert's, and for a moment it seemed as though time itself had frozen. Then with a heavy sigh, Moore stood and addressed the room. "We will investigate further," Moore said, his voice low but firm. "But understand this, gentlemen, the truth has already been spoken, and no matter how hard you try to bury it, the truth will always come to light." The room was silent, and Hebert felt a strange sense of resolve. It wasn't the outcome he had hoped for, but it was a start. The fight for justice had just begun. The next few days were filled with uncertainty and tension. Hebert knew that the authorities had taken the first step by acknowledging the need for further investigation, but he also knew that the forces aligned against them were formidable. The plantation owners were not going to let this go quietly. They would do everything in their power to suppress the truth, to protect their wealth and the system that had kept them in power for so long. Hebert could feel the weight of the battle ahead. In the days following the meeting with the authorities, Hebert and Sheriff Moore worked in secret, gathering additional evidence and speaking with the women who had been affected by Levine's actions. The testimonies were harrowing, each one revealing more about the manipulation and exploitation that had taken place. The enslaved women spoke of Levine's strange treatments, medicines and concoctions they had been given without their knowledge of what they contained. They spoke of the strange births, of the children who bore features that were so out of place, and the fear they had felt when Levine's visits became more frequent. Despite the growing evidence, Hebert could see that the authorities were reluctant to act. The system of slavery was deeply embedded in the fabric of society, and exposing the truth about Levine's actions threatened to unravel the entire system. The plantation owners had long held power over the law, and Hebert feared that they would use their influence to protect Levine and silence anyone who dared to challenge the status quo. Marie, the mother of the first blue-eyed child, had become a central figure in the movement. She had spoken out bravely, giving testimony about Levine's involvement in her pregnancy and the strange birth of her daughter, Claire. As Hebert spent more time with her, he began to realize the depth of her courage. She had not only borne the burden of her own suffering, but had become a voice for the other enslaved women who had been victimized by Levine's actions. Marie's determination and quiet strength had ignited something in Hebert, something that made him believe that they could actually bring about change. "We can't stop now," Marie told him one evening as they sat in a quiet room preparing for their next steps. "The truth is already out there. We've spoken it. We've made them see. Now we have to make sure they can't ignore us." Hebert nodded, feeling the weight of her words. The movement they had started could not stop now, no matter how hard the plantation owners tried to suppress it. "But how do we make them act?" he asked. "They'll try to bury it. They'll use their power to shut us down." Marie's eyes were filled with determination. "We don't let them. We go to the people. We speak to those who are still afraid to stand up, those who don't know what's really happening. We take the truth to them. We make sure they know what's at stake." Hebert agreed. They needed to expand the movement to reach the hearts of those who had been silenced for so long. The enslaved people, the workers, and the townsfolk who had been living under the shadow of the plantation system needed to hear the truth. They needed to understand what Levine had done and how it was just one piece of the larger system of exploitation and oppression that had been allowed to thrive for generations. That night, Hebert and Marie made plans to organize a public meeting in the town square. It would be a risky move. If the authorities got wind of it, they could shut it down before it even began. But Hebert knew that the time had come to take a stand. They had already done everything they could in secret, but it was no longer enough. The truth had to be shared with the world. The following week, as the town square began to fill with people, Hebert and Marie stood at the front, waiting for the gathering to begin. There was a palpable sense of excitement in the air, but also fear. The townspeople had never seen anything like this before. The enslaved people, who had always been expected to remain invisible, were standing up, speaking out, demanding justice. Hebert could see the fear in their eyes as they gathered in the square. Some were afraid of the authorities. Others were afraid of the plantation owners and what they might do if they spoke out. But there was something else too: hope. The truth was spreading, and with it came the possibility of change. The enslaved people were no longer willing to remain silent. They were demanding justice, and they were no longer afraid to fight for it. Marie stepped forward, her voice steady and strong as she addressed the crowd. "We are here today because we can no longer live in fear. We are here today because we have suffered long enough. Dr. Levine, a man who was supposed to help us, has used us for his own purposes. He has manipulated our bodies, altered our lives, and we are here to make sure that he cannot continue to do so. We are here to demand justice for ourselves, for our children, and for every person who has been treated as less than human." The crowd was silent for a moment, but then murmurs of agreement began to ripple through the gathering. Hebert could feel the shift in the air. The people were listening. They were ready to stand with them. "We have already spoken the truth," Marie continued, her voice rising with conviction. "And now we must stand together to make sure that truth cannot be buried again. We will not be silenced. We will not be ignored. This is our fight, and we will fight it together." The crowd erupted into applause, and Hebert felt a surge of hope. This was only the beginning. The authorities, the plantation owners, and Levine himself would try to stop them, but they had already ignited something powerful. The people were waking up. They were beginning to understand that they didn't have to live in fear anymore. Together, they could change the world. But as the crowd cheered, Hebert's heart sank. The sound of galloping hooves reached his ears, and he knew that the plantation owners were not far behind. The time for talk was over. The time for action had arrived. As the sound of galloping hooves grew louder, a chill ran through the crowd. Hebert's eyes scanned the town square, and soon enough, he saw the unmistakable figures of Mr. Duchamp and his armed guards riding into view. They were coming to silence them, to stop the movement before it could gain any more momentum. Hebert's pulse quickened, but his resolve only strengthened. He knew this moment was coming, but that didn't make the confrontation any less intense. The crowd, once filled with excitement and determination, grew tense. Hebert could feel the shift in the air. The energy that had been so strong just moments before now felt fragile. The town square was still, as if everyone was holding their breath. The men who had come to shut them down were powerful, and Hebert knew that they would not hesitate to use force. Duchamp had always been a man who valued control. He wouldn't let this challenge to his power go unpunished. Duchamp pulled his horse to a stop at the front of the crowd, dismounting with an air of authority. His cold, calculating eyes locked onto Hebert and Marie as he took in the scene before him. Hebert's stomach churned. The man had always represented everything Hebert hated about the plantation system: the greed, the exploitation, the callousness with which they treated the enslaved. Duchamp wasn't just a man, he was the embodiment of everything that needed to change. "I see we have gathered quite a crowd," Duchamp said, his voice dripping with disdain. "But I must remind you all that this is not the time nor the place for your little rebellion. You have no right to stir up trouble here." Marie stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "We have every right, Duchamp. You've used us, manipulated us, and now we will no longer be silent. This is about justice, not just for us, but for the children who have been born into this world of cruelty and deceit. The truth is out, and it can't be buried anymore." Duchamp's face twisted with fury, and for a moment Hebert thought he might lash out. But instead Duchamp's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Justice?" he sneered. "What justice are you talking about, Marie? You think that by speaking out, you're going to change anything? You think you can break the system that has worked for centuries? You're nothing more than troublemakers, and you'll be dealt with accordingly." Hebert could see the anger in Duchamp's eyes, but he wasn't intimidated. He had heard these words before, the threats, the attempts to silence him and the others. But now there was something different in the air. The people, once cowered by fear, were beginning to realize that they didn't have to live in silence anymore. The power of the truth had already begun to shift the balance, and no matter how hard Duchamp and his men tried to hold on to the old ways, it was slipping from their grasp. "We will never stop fighting," Marie said, her voice steady and strong. "We have already spoken the truth, and we will make sure it is heard. You can't intimidate us. You can't silence us." For a brief moment, Duchamp's mask of confidence faltered. He could feel the shift in the crowd, the sense of unity that was beginning to build. These weren't just a few enslaved people and their supporters anymore. This was a movement, one that had taken root and was spreading like wildfire. The people were beginning to see what they had never seen before: their own power. "You think you can change this system with your words?" Duchamp asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "You're a fool, Marie. And you, Hebert, you've aligned yourself with them, with these people who have no place in this world. You've betrayed everything you've ever known." Hebert felt the sting of Duchamp's words, but they didn't land the way they used to. He had spent years upholding the plantation system, making sure that everything ran smoothly, turning a blind eye to the suffering of the enslaved. But now, after everything he had witnessed, the birth of those strange children, the manipulations by Levine, the bravery of Marie and the others, Hebert knew that he could never go back. Duchamp and his men no longer held power over him. It was the truth that held power now, and Hebert was ready to wield it. "We've already seen the truth, Duchamp," Hebert said, his voice firm, "and it's time for you to face it. You can try to intimidate us, but the truth is stronger than your power. The truth will tear down the walls you've built, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." The crowd behind Hebert and Marie began to stir, the energy in the air shifting again. The people were no longer just passive observers. They were ready to stand up. They were ready to fight. But Duchamp wasn't ready to let go. He gestured to his men, and within moments, they began to move forward, their hands on their weapons. The air was thick with tension. Hebert knew that things could turn violent in an instant. Marie stepped forward again, her eyes fixed on Duchamp. "If you want to fight us, then we'll fight," she said, her voice cold and steady. "But know this, we will never stop. No matter what you do, we will never stop fighting for justice." Duchamp's eyes narrowed as he watched Marie. He could see the resolve in her face, the same resolve that Hebert had seen in the faces of the other enslaved people who had come forward to speak the truth. It was no longer about one man's crimes. It was about dismantling the entire system that had allowed those crimes to occur in the first place. The stand they had taken was not just about Levine or Duchamp. It was about the future of every enslaved person who had been silenced, exploited, and abused for so long. It was about their right to be heard, to be free, and to demand justice. As the confrontation in the square continued, Hebert knew that this moment would be remembered forever. It was a pivotal point in the struggle for justice, a moment when the enslaved no longer stood in the shadows, but stepped into the light. And no matter what happened next, Hebert felt a surge of pride for everything they had accomplished. But as Duchamp's men drew closer, Hebert and Marie both knew that the fight was far from over. It had only just begun. The tension in the air was thick as Duchamp's men moved closer, their hands resting on their weapons, prepared to take action. The crowd was restless, some fearful, others defiant. Hebert could feel his heart racing, knowing that the situation was spiraling toward a dangerous confrontation. This wasn't just a clash between Hebert, Marie, and the plantation owners. It was a battle for something much larger. The truth they had spoken, the voices of the enslaved, were all on the line. Marie stood firm at the front of the crowd, her gaze fixed on Duchamp, unflinching despite the growing danger. She was no longer just an enslaved woman. She had become a symbol of resistance, of hope, of the fight for justice. And as Hebert stood beside her, he realized just how far they had come. They had started with a single story, a single truth, and now they were standing together, united with others who had once been too afraid to speak out. "We're not backing down," Marie's voice rang out, strong and unwavering. "We will not be intimidated by you. You can try to silence us, but the truth is louder than any weapon you have." Duchamp's eyes narrowed, his face twisting with frustration. He had never expected this kind of resistance. The enslaved had always been compliant, always obedient, but something had changed. These people weren't afraid anymore. They weren't content to remain in the shadows. Duchamp's grip tightened on his reins, and he motioned for his men to step forward. "This is your last warning," Duchamp spat, his voice cold with anger. "You've made your point, but you will not get away with this. I will not allow this rebellion to spread any further. You think you can destroy everything we've worked for? You think you can tear down the system that has supported this town for generations?" Hebert felt a surge of anger, but he knew that the time for anger was past. The fight had to be about more than just words. It had to be about action. "You've been living off the suffering of others for too long, Duchamp," Hebert said, his voice steady, his words measured. "It's time for that to end. No matter how many men you send, no matter how much power you think you have, the truth is already here. It's been spoken, and it can't be taken back." The crowd behind Hébert and Marie began to murmur in agreement, the energy in the air shifting again. The people were no longer passive observers. They were active participants in this movement. They had come together to stand for something larger than themselves, something that threatened to tear down the very system that had kept them subjugated. Duchamp's face turned crimson with rage, and for a moment, Hébert thought he might charge at them with all the force of his anger. But instead Duchamp hesitated, his eyes scanning the crowd. There was something in his gaze, something that told Hébert that even Duchamp, for all his power and arrogance, was beginning to feel the weight of what was happening. "Don't mistake this for victory," Duchamp sneered. "You're nothing but troublemakers, and you will regret this." Before Duchamp could say more, one of his men, a large figure with a grim expression, stepped forward. "Sir," the man said, his voice low, "there's no need for this to escalate further. They've made their point. We can't just start a bloodshed over this." For a brief moment, Hébert thought that the situation might de-escalate, that the fear of violence, the fear of consequences, might have reached the plantation owners. But Duchamp's fury flared again. He turned to the man who had spoken, his voice low and dangerous. "No," he snapped, "they've gone too far. If we let them get away with this now, we'll be the ones who are destroyed. We can't let them challenge us." But Duchamp's resolve was beginning to falter. He could see that the crowd was not backing down. They were ready to stand firm, to fight if necessary. And the realization that this was no longer just a confrontation between a few people, it was a rebellion, settled over him like a heavy weight. For the first time, Duchamp realized that the power he had so easily wielded for years was slipping away. Marie took another step forward, her voice carrying through the air with a strength that made the surrounding crowd quiet. "We will not be silenced. The truth cannot be hidden anymore. You've built your empire on the backs of the enslaved, but we will not let you continue. It's over. The truth will always rise, no matter how much you try to bury it." Duchamp's expression hardened, but for the first time Hébert saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The plantation owner understood, perhaps too late, that the people were no longer afraid of him. The truth had been exposed, and it could not be erased. As Hébert looked around at the people standing beside him, enslaved women, workers, and even some townsfolk who had come to show their support, he felt a sense of solidarity he had never experienced before. This wasn't just about Levine's crimes. This was about the entire system of slavery, about the way the oppressed had been dehumanized for so long. The guards, who had been poised to strike, seemed to hesitate, unsure of how to respond to the shifting energy in the crowd. Duchamp saw the hesitation and, in a moment of desperation, barked at them to advance. But before they could take another step, Sheriff Moore, who had been observing the scene, stepped forward, his voice booming through the square. "Enough!" Moore's command rang out, halting the guards in their tracks. He turned to face Duchamp, his expression grim. "You've made your point, Duchamp, but I won't allow any violence to break out here. These people are standing for something much greater than you, and you will not silence them." Duchamp, seeing that Moore had taken a stand, narrowed his eyes. He knew that the sheriff's influence in the town meant something. But even then, Duchamp couldn't bring himself to back down completely. "This isn't over," Duchamp muttered under his breath, mounting his horse. "You'll regret this, all of you." With that, he signaled to his men, and the group turned, riding off into the distance. The crowd remained still for a moment, the weight of what had just transpired sinking in. Hébert looked at Marie, her eyes filled with a quiet victory. They had faced down the plantation owners. They had spoken the truth in front of the very people who had once held all the power. And for the first time, Hébert felt a real sense of change in the air. The truth had been spoken, and no matter how hard the plantation owners tried to suppress it, it was already too late. The moment Duchamp and his men retreated from the town square, the tension in the air began to slowly dissipate. The crowd, still buzzing with adrenaline, watched as the plantation owner and his guards vanished from sight, but the victory wasn't entirely theirs yet. While the immediate threat had subsided, Hébert knew the battle was far from over. Duchamp's departure was not an end. It was just a brief pause before the forces of the plantation system regrouped and retaliated. Hébert turned to Marie, his heart still pounding from the confrontation. The fire in her eyes hadn't dimmed. If anything, it had only grown stronger. She was a leader now, a voice for the voiceless, and Hébert admired the resolve that had brought her to this point. They had faced the mighty Duchamp and his armed men and stood their ground, but Hébert knew the real fight was ahead. "We've made a statement," Marie said quietly, her voice calm but fierce. "But we can't stop now. We need to spread the truth. We need to make sure that what happened here isn't forgotten. We've come too far to let fear take over." Hébert nodded. "You're right. We can't let them intimidate us back into silence. This movement, it's bigger than any one of us now. We need to make sure the town hears our voices, and we need to take it further, bring in more support." Marie stepped back, scanning the crowd. The people who had gathered were still silent, but it was clear they were processing what had just happened. They had stood together, and for the first time in their lives, they had seen the power of unity. They had faced down the forces of oppression, and for a moment had won. But Marie was right. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. Hébert watched as the crowd slowly began to disperse, some of the townspeople exchanging uncertain looks. Many of them were still unsure about whether to publicly support the movement, but Hébert could sense a shift. Fear had been replaced by something else, something stronger: hope. The truth had been spoken in public for the first time. It had been seen, acknowledged, and for those willing to listen, it could no longer be denied. As the crowd began to thin, Hébert turned to Sheriff Moore, who had stood by his side during the confrontation. Moore had been an invaluable ally in this fight, though Hébert knew that supporting the movement had cost him dearly. The sheriff was part of a system that he had sworn to uphold, and going against that system was a dangerous choice. "We have to keep the pressure on," Moore said, his voice low, but filled with a quiet resolve. "This isn't going to go away quietly. The plantation owners will come after us. They'll use their influence to make sure this doesn't spread. But you've made an impact today. It's the first step." Hébert felt the weight of Moore's words. It was clear that Moore was trying to warn him about the challenges ahead. The plantation owners wouldn't let this public defiance slide. They would retaliate. But Hébert also knew that there was no turning back now. What had started as a whisper had turned into a roar, and there was no silencing it. The truth was out, and it would continue to spread. "We'll have to be smart," Hébert replied. "We'll need to gather more support, more voices. We've exposed Levine, but we need to make sure that we keep pushing. We can't afford to stop." As they spoke, a figure approached from the shadows of the square. A woman, her face obscured by a shawl. When she came closer, Hébert recognized her. It was Isabelle, one of the women who had spoken out about Levine's treatment. She had been hesitant to speak in front of the authorities, but her bravery had inspired others. "I couldn't leave," Isabelle said quietly, her eyes flicking nervously around the square. "I wanted to thank you both for giving us a voice, for making sure we're not forgotten." Marie smiled softly, her expression warm but knowing. "You've given us a voice too, Isabelle. This fight is ours, together. We stand for each other now." Isabelle nodded, her face full of gratitude. "I know, and I'm not afraid anymore. My children may never know the truth of what happened to us, but I'll make sure everyone else does. We have to make sure that people don't forget what Levine did. He can't get away with it." Hébert's heart swelled with pride. The courage of these women, their willingness to speak out despite the immense danger, was what would change everything. They had already begun to dismantle the silence that had been imposed on them for so long. The truth had broken free, and there was no going back. Marie turned to Hébert and Moore. "We need to go beyond the town. The enslaved, the workers. There are others who need to hear this. They need to see that they're not alone. The truth is more than just words. It's a call to action. Hebert nodded. We'll organize, but it's going to take time. We can't risk moving too quickly. If we try to force the issue, they'll crush us. Then we move in the shadows, Moore said. We gather the voices we can trust, and we take the message to the people who can make a difference. Not just in this town, but across the plantations. This isn't just about one man or one doctor. It's about the whole system. The three of them stood in the square, the sounds of the evening settling around them. The night had fallen, and with it came the realization that the fight for justice was only just beginning. They had exposed Levine, but now they had to take that truth and spread it, make sure it couldn't be suppressed by those in power. Marie's words rang in Hebert's ears. The truth is more than just words. It's a call to action. He knew what that meant now. It was about more than exposing a few individuals. It was about dismantling the system that had allowed their suffering to continue. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but Hebert understood that they had already begun something irreversible. Hebert looked at Marie, then at Moore. They were ready. The movement had been ignited, and though they didn't know what the future held, Hebert felt a surge of hope. They would face many challenges ahead, but they had one thing the plantation owners could never take from them: the truth. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity. Hebert, Marie, and Sheriff Moore worked tirelessly to expand their movement. They had made a bold stand in the town square, but now it was time to ensure that their message reached far beyond the confines of the town. The truth about Dr. Levine's manipulations, the strange births, and the deep-rooted injustices of the plantation system needed to spread to every corner of Louisiana. Hebert knew that if they were to succeed, they needed to act carefully, with strategy and determination. Every step they took had to be deliberate. Marie was a tireless force, organizing secret meetings with other enslaved people, workers, and sympathetic townsfolk. Her voice had become a beacon of hope, and she was quickly gaining the trust of those who had been too afraid to speak out. The women who had come forward, like Isabel, were also becoming leaders within the community, encouraging others to join the cause. The enslaved were no longer just silent victims. They were becoming active participants in their own liberation. Hebert had never seen anything like it. The shift in the air was palpable. For so long, the enslaved had been forced to live in fear, their voices silenced by the system that had kept them oppressed. But now they were speaking out, demanding justice, and they were finding strength in each other. The bonds that had been forged in the silence of oppression were now being transformed into a collective voice for change. As they worked to organize the movement, Hebert couldn't help but notice the growing tension. The plantation owners, despite their initial retreat from the town square, were not backing down. They had not forgotten the confrontation, and Hebert knew that they were regrouping, preparing for their next move. They had the power, the resources, and the influence to crush this movement before it could grow too large. Hebert understood the stakes. He could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on him. Marie, as always, remained focused. She refused to let fear or doubt cloud their mission. "We've started something that can't be stopped," she said to Hebert one evening as they planned their next move. "But we have to be smart. The plantation owners will try to crush us. We have to make sure we're ready. We have to take this beyond the town, beyond the plantations. We need to bring the truth to the people." Hebert nodded. "We need to make sure they can't ignore us. The authorities are already hesitant, and we can't let them bury this again. The people have to see the truth for themselves. They have to understand what's at stake." Marie was right. Hebert knew that the movement's strength lay in the people, the townsfolk, the workers, and the enslaved. But the truth could only change things if it was heard by enough people. Hebert and Marie worked together to strategize. They began to organize a larger public event, one that would bring together a wide cross-section of people. It would be risky, but it was the next logical step. If they could galvanize enough support, they could pressure the authorities to take action. Meanwhile, Sheriff Moore continued to serve as a quiet ally. Though he had been careful about how involved he could get, he was becoming more vocal in his support. Hebert had noticed a change in the sheriff's demeanor. Moore, like many others, had lived his life within the system of slavery, but now as the truth came to light, he could no longer deny the horror of it. Hebert knew that Moore's support would be crucial if they were to push for real change. As the plans for the public event took shape, Hebert found himself grappling with a growing sense of fear. They had already exposed Levine, but the authorities and the plantation owners were not giving up. Every day, Hebert felt the pressure building. He knew that the moment they stepped into the public eye again, the full force of the plantation system would descend upon them. The event was scheduled for a week later, and the preparations were well underway. The word had spread, quietly at first, then more openly. People from the plantations, townsfolk, and workers from nearby farms began to show up in increasing numbers. Hebert could feel the excitement building, but there was also an undercurrent of anxiety. Would the authorities try to shut it down before it even began? Would they be able to stand their ground when the plantation owners inevitably tried to force them into silence? On the day of the event, the town square was filled with people, their faces a mix of determination and uncertainty. Hebert could sense the weight of the moment hanging in the air. This was more than just another public speech or gathering. It was the culmination of everything they had worked for. This was their chance to show the world that the truth could no longer be ignored. Marie stood at the front, her presence commanding. She had become the voice of this movement, the face of the fight for justice. Hebert watched as she stepped forward to speak. Her voice rang out clear and strong, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. We stand here today because we refuse to be silenced any longer. For too long we have lived in fear. For too long we have been treated as less than human. But today we speak the truth about what has been done to us, and the truth about the system that has kept us oppressed for generations. We will not be silenced. We will not be ignored. We are here to demand justice, not just for ourselves, but for all the men, women, and children who have been stolen from this world. The crowd fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Then, slowly, the murmurs began again, and Hebert could feel the energy shift. The people were no longer just listening, they were absorbing the message. They were standing together, unified in their demand for justice. The time for silence had passed. Marie continued, her voice growing even stronger. We know the truth, and we will not back down. We will keep fighting until Levine is held accountable, until the system of slavery that has allowed this to happen is destroyed. We are here to tell the world that we will no longer live in fear. The truth will set us free. The crowd erupted into applause, the sound reverberating through the square. Hebert's chest swelled with pride. They had done it. The truth had been spoken. But Hebert also knew that this was only the beginning. The plantation owners would not sit idly by while their empire was threatened. The real fight was still ahead, and Hebert was ready for it. The roar of the crowd in the town square felt like a distant thunderclap in Hebert's ears as he stood beside Marie. The energy was palpable, and for a moment it seemed as though the very foundations of the plantation system might crack under the weight of the truth they had spoken. People from every corner of the town, from the enslaved workers to the sympathetic townsfolk, stood together, united in their desire for justice. It was a powerful sight, one that Hebert would never forget. But even as the crowd cheered, Hebert couldn't ignore the cold truth that hung over them. The plantation owners had already shown their willingness to fight back, to use whatever means necessary to maintain their control. Duchamp's retreat had been a temporary victory, but Hebert knew that the real challenge lay ahead. The truth had been spoken, but the fight was far from over. It was just the beginning. Marie, ever the calm and determined leader, turned to Hebert as the applause began to die down. This is just the start, Vincent. We've given them a taste of what's to come, but we can't stop now. We have to take this further, spread the truth even farther. Hebert nodded, his mind racing with the possibilities. The event had been a success, but the authorities could still find ways to suppress the movement. The plantation owners would regroup and retaliate, just as they always had. The system of control that had kept the enslaved in their place for so long was built on fear and silence, and now that silence had been shattered. The plantation owners would fight to keep their empire intact, no matter the cost. "We need to move quickly," Hebert said, his voice low but resolute. "The authorities won't let this go without a fight. We need to get the message out to as many people as possible. If we can build support from the other plantations, from the workers, we might have a chance." Marie's gaze was focused, her mind already working through the next steps. "We have to be careful. We can't just march into the plantations. We need to find the right people, those who are ready to join us, who understand what's at stake. We need to speak to the ones who have the courage to fight back." As they spoke, Sheriff Moore stepped forward, his expression grim but determined. Hebert had grown to trust the sheriff over the past few months. Moore had always been part of the system, but his growing awareness of its injustices had pushed him to take action. The sheriff was now a reluctant ally in the fight, but Hebert knew that without him, their movement would be much weaker. "The plantation owners aren't going to sit back and let this slide," Moore said, his voice steady. "They've got the power, the resources, and the men to strike back hard. We need to be ready. We need to find allies in the right places." Hebert agreed. They needed to stay one step ahead of the plantation owners, but that meant moving carefully. The sheriff's support was invaluable, but Moore also had limits. He had a career to protect, and any overt move to publicly support the movement could cost him everything. But for now, he was with them, and that was all Hebert could ask for. "We'll keep pushing," Hebert said, turning to Marie. "We'll keep organizing, keep spreading the truth. We'll find the right people, and we'll make sure that the authorities can't ignore us." Marie's eyes shone with quiet determination. "We have to make sure they hear us. The truth will tear down the walls they built. The more people we have, the harder it will be for them to stop us." As they continued to talk strategy, Hebert couldn't help but feel the weight of the fight ahead. They had exposed the truth, but the forces aligned against them were powerful and entrenched. The plantation owners weren't going to give up without a fight. They would use their wealth, their influence, and their violence to protect the system they had built. And even if the authorities were sympathetic, Hebert knew they were unlikely to act decisively. Despite the risks, Hebert couldn't back down. The truth was too powerful to ignore, and he had seen the strength of the people who had come together to fight for justice. Marie, the women who had spoken out, the workers and townsfolk, they were all ready to stand and fight. They had already proven that they were not afraid, and Hebert knew that they would continue to stand up, no matter the cost. In the days that followed, Hebert and Marie continued to organize, meeting with trusted allies and spreading the word. They carefully planned their next steps, making sure they didn't overreach too quickly. Every meeting, every conversation was an opportunity to build support, to strengthen their movement. They spoke to the workers on the nearby plantations, to the townsfolk who had been silent for so long, urging them to join the fight. The truth had ignited something powerful, and Hebert knew that they couldn't let it fade. But even as their movement grew, the shadow of retaliation loomed over them. The plantation owners were not blind. They knew that the tide was shifting, and they would stop at nothing to protect their wealth and their power. Hebert could feel the danger growing with each passing day. The stakes were higher than ever, and every move they made could be their last. And yet, despite the risks, despite the threat of violence and retribution, Hebert felt a deep, unshakable conviction. This was their moment. They had come this far, and they could not stop now. They had exposed the truth. They had shown the world that they were no longer afraid to fight for what was right. And no matter what happened next, Hebert knew one thing for certain: they would keep fighting. For the enslaved women, for the children born into a world of exploitation, and for every person who had suffered in silence, they would not rest until justice was done. The fight had only just begun.